Ron Paul was right, and I was wrong. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government. DailyTorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about it's obviously September 11th, and I wanted to give you a few thoughts of mine about things like the Patriot Act and other tools like the Department of Homeland Security that were put into place after the attacks that were designed to make America more safe, to protect us from terrorist attacks that would be foreign terrorists or domestic terrorists, and invariably how this was used against not only bad guys, but maybe the American people as well. I think we've seen examples of this where provisions of the Patriot Act expanded provisions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA Act, that used the FISA court that was put into place in the 1970s in response to government abuses of its surveillance powers against anti-war protesters, civil rights leaders, and so forth in the 60s and in the 70s. And so eventually you get to Frank Church, Senator Frank Church. He has the Church Committee, and then they enact the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Ultimately, it became a tool for the surveillance state. We have rubber stamp at the FISA court. We actually made FISA court rubber stamps after it was revealed that in 2016, the federal government was spying on the Donald Trump presidential campaign. And this was being used basically for political purposes to carry on a dragnet under made up allegations that Donald Trump was a Russian agent. And so, you kind of come full circle with these things. You don't fear the tools of government until they're used against you. The American Revolution, such as it was, might not have happened if King George wasn't such a tyrant. But that's what experience is for. That's what, age brings. And also an ability to be kind of introspective and to look back on things. And so I wanted to start out with just looking at the Patriot Act. Here it is, the HR 3162, Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism, USA Patriot Act. Let me double check my audio here, make sure we're on the right settings here. Yeah, we're all good here. So we have here, this was legislation. This was enacted. It passed the House on October 12th, 2001. It passed the Senate on October 11, 2001. And ultimately, it becomes law on October 26th, 2001. This is a Wikipedia article. Patriot Act was a landmark act of the United States Congress signed into law by President George W. Bush. The formal name was the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. Act of 2001, the commonly used shorthand, is a contrived acronym that is embedded in the name set forth in the statute. It was enacted following September 11th attacks and 2001 anthrax attacks with the stated goal of tightening U.S. national security, particularly as it related to foreign terrorism. In general, the act included three main provisions: expanded surveillance abilities of law enforcement, including by tapping domestic and international phones, easier interagency communication to allow federal agencies to more effectively use all available resources in counterterrorism efforts, and increased penalties for terrorism crimes, and as an expanded list of activities which would qualify for terrorism charges. And I should note that abuses under the FISA system and also with warrantless surveillance, obviously FISA warrants do go to a FISA court. It's a secret court. So no one can challenge what the FISA, if they put you under surveillance, you can't challenge that. You won't even know about it unless they're later arresting you or coming to question you or something like that. And, one of the people who brought, the first kind of public awareness to what was going on with the FISA system was Ed Snowden. He had to flee to Russia after he disclosed that there was vast surveillance. He revealed I think it was the first time anyone had any knowledge of a FISA court warrant, but it was against 200 million Americans. They were using the phone records of the American people to to look at the phone numbers, and then but there were other allegations after the Boston Marathon bombing that you could kind of go back in time to get recordings of, the suspects, the Tsarnaev brothers, on cell phones, even though they hadn't been previously recorded. How could you go back and listen to it? But that's what FBI counterintelligence officials were saying on TV at the time. And so I think you kind of, was the NSA recording everything? And then, oh, well, if we need to go back and find out what happened, there's a threat to the homeland, we got to go look at that, or something like that. In any event, it would have been made possible by laws like the Patriot Act, which passed overwhelmingly naturally after September 11th. This is on October 24, 2001. The date I read on the other one was incorrect. So it's October 24, 2001, and this is HR 3162. It's 357 to 66. There were 3 no votes. Ron Paul, U.S. representative, former of Texas, he was one of those no votes. So there was that one. Here was in the U.S. Senate, October 25, 2001, 98 to 1. There was only 1 no vote. So there was also 1 person not voting. Let's see who voted no. Russ Feingold. And Mary Landrieu, I don't know, she wasn't voting or she wasn't there that day, but only Russ Feingold, Democrat, Wisconsin, said, no, we shouldn't do the Patriot Act. That's a bad idea. Now, Ron Paul was warning against the law, as this argument was going on. You can actually go back and review Ron Paul's speeches and statements from 2001 if you go to the web archive. And so I wanted to pull up something he had stated, some warning he had issued prior to the passage of the Patriot Act. And I was able to find one on October 12, 2001. Okay, let's see. He says that he was talking about one of the predecessors' bills. So this was the Securing American Families Effectively Act. And I think parts of this and ultimately get wrapped up into what becomes the Patriot Act. So I think what he's saying here applies equally to his objections to the Patriot Act. He stated that other provisions of this bill represent a major infringement of the American people's constitutional rights. I'm afraid that if these provisions are signed into law, the American people will lose parts of their liberty. Maybe not today, but over time, as agencies grow more comfortable exercising their new powers. My concerns are exacerbated by the fact that the bill lacks many of the protections of civil liberties which the House Judiciary Committee worked to put into the version of the bill they considered. In fact, the process under which we are asked to consider this bill makes it nearly impossible to fulfill our constitutional responsibility to carefully consider measures which dramatically increase government's powers. Many of the most constitutionally offensive measures in this bill are not limited to terrorist offenses, but apply to any criminal activity. In fact, some of the new police powers granted the government could be applied even to those engaging in peaceful protest against government policies. The bill, as written, defines terrorism as acts intended, quote, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. Under this broad definition, Paul argued, should a scuffle occur at an otherwise peaceful pro-life demonstration, the sponsoring organization may become the target of a federal investigation for terrorism. We have seen abuses of law enforcement authority in the past to harass individuals or organizations with unpopular political views. I hope my colleagues consider that they may be handing a future administration tools to investigate pro-life or gun rights organizations on the grounds that fringe members of their movements advocate violence. It is an unfortunate reality that almost every political movement today, from gun rights to environmentalism, has a violent fringe. I am very disturbed by the provisions centralizing the power to issue writs of habeas corpus to federal courts located in the District of Columbia. Habeas corpus is one of the most powerful checks on government, and anything which burdens the ability to exercise this right expands the potential for government abuses of liberty. I ask my colleagues to remember that in the centuries of experience with habeas corpus, there is no evidence that it interferes with legitimate interests of law enforcement. And he goes on. And he made obviously countless statements during this time, not only warning against the Patriot Act, but before and after it was passed. but just the foreign wars that we were about to engage in. Heading over to Afghanistan, he spoke out against the war there. He spoke out against the war in Iraq. He said it would go on for a very long time, and he turned out to be right. He was right about how long of a commitment we were in for. I think he was also right about he was talking about blowback at the time. And so these would have been kind of, very unpatriotic things to say at the time. But I thought it would be interesting to listen to one of his speeches. This is on November 29th, 2001. This is about a month after the Patriot Act has passed, and people are really starting to learn what's in the bill. And so he, I think, gives a really good speech here that's worth listening to, because it offered a warning about how these powers would eventually be used against the American people. It's like, well, you start out, you're looking for terrorists, you're looking for bad guys, but eventually you're going to start targeting American citizens with this, and maybe citizens who are innocent. Take a listen to this. This is really interesting.
The counter-argument made by the Second Amendment supporters correctly explained that this would only undermine the freedom of law-abiding citizens and do nothing to keep guns out of the hands of the criminals or to reduce crime. Now we hear a similar argument that a certain amount of privacy and personal liberty of law-abiding citizens must be sacrificed in order to root out possible terrorists. This will result only in liberties being lost and will not serve to preempt any terrorist attack. The criminals, just as they know how to get guns even when they are illegal, will still be able to circumvent anti-terrorist laws. To believe otherwise is to endorse a Faustian bargain, but that is what I believe the Congress has done. We know from the ongoing drug war that federal drug police not infrequently makes mistakes, breaks down the wrong doors and destroys property. Abuses of seizure and forfeiture laws are numerous, yet the new laws will encourage even more mistakes by federal law enforcement agencies. It has long been forgotten that law enforcement in the United States was supposed to be a state and local government responsibility, not that of the federal government. The federal government's policing powers have just gotten a giant boost in scope and authority through both new legislation and executive orders. Before the 9/11 attack, Attorney General Ashcroft let his position be known regarding privacy and government secrecy. Executive Order 13223 made it much more difficult for researchers to gain access to presidential documents from previous administrations, and a need to know had to be demonstrated. This was a direct hit at efforts to demand openness in government, even if only for analysis and writing of history. Ashcroft's position is that presidential records ought to remain secret even after an administration has left office. He argues that government deserves privacy while ignoring the Fourth Amendment protections of the people's privacy. He argues his case by absurdly claiming that he must protect the privacy of the individuals who might be involved, a non-problem that could easily be resolved without closing public records to the public. It is estimated that approximately 1,200 men have been arrested as a consequence of the 9/11 attacks, yet their names and charges are not available, and according to Ashcroft, will not be made available. Once again, he uses the argument that he's protecting their privacy. Unbelievable. Due process for the detainees has been denied. Secret government is winning out over open government. This is the largest number of people to be locked up under these conditions since FDR's internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Information regarding these arrests is a must in a constitutional republic. If they're terrorists or accomplices, just let the public know and pursue their prosecution. But secret arrests and silence are not acceptable in a society that professes to be free. Curtailing freedom is not the answer to protecting freedom under adverse circumstances. The administration has severely curtailed briefings regarding the military operation in Afghanistan for congressional leaders, ignoring a long-time tradition in this country. One person or one branch of government should never control military operations. Our system of government has always required a shared power arrangement. The anti-terrorism bill did little to restrain the growth of big government. In the name of patriotism, the Congress did some very unpatriotic things. Instead of concentrating on the persons or groups that committed the attacks on 9/11, our efforts, unfortunately, have undermined the liberties of all Americans. Know your customer type banking regulations, resisted by most Americans for years, have now been put in place in an expanded fashion. Not only will the regulations affect banks, thrifts, and credit unions, but all businesses will be required to file suspicious transaction reports if cash is used, with the total of the transaction reaching $10,000. Retail stores will be required to spy on all their customers and send reports to the U.S. government. Financial service consultants are convinced that this new regulation will affect literally millions of law-abiding American citizens. The odds that this additional paperwork will catch a terrorist are remote. The sad part is that these regulations have been sought after by federal law enforcement agencies for years. The 9/11 attacks have served as an opportunity to get them by the Congress and the American people. Only now are the American people hearing about the onerous portions of the anti-terrorism legislation, and they are not pleased. It's easy for elected officials in Washington to tell the American people that the government will do whatever it takes to defeat terrorism. Such assurances inevitably are followed by proposals either to restrict the constitutional liberties of the American people or to spend vast sums of money from the federal treasury. The history of the 20th century shows that the Congress violates our Constitution most often during times of crises. Accordingly, most of our worst unconstitutional agencies and programs began during the World Wars and the Depression. Ironically, the Constitution itself was conceived in a time of great crisis. The founders intended its provision to place severe restriction on the federal government, even in times of great distress. America must guard against current calls for the government to sacrifice the Constitution in the name of law enforcement. The anti-terrorism legislation recently passed by Congress demonstrates how well-meaning politicians make short-sighted mistakes in a rush to respond to a crisis. Most of its provisions were never carefully studied by Congress, nor was a sufficient time taken to debate the bill despite its importance. No testimony was heard from privacy experts or from other fields outside of law enforcement. Normal congressional committee and hearing processes were suspended. In fact, the final version of the bill was not even made available to members before the vote. The American public should not tolerate these political games, especially when our precious freedoms are at stake. Almost all of the new laws focus on American citizens rather than potential foreign terrorists. For example, the definition of terrorism for federal criminal purposes has been greatly expanded. A person could now be considered a terrorist by belonging to a pro-Constitution group, a citizens militia, or a pro-life organization. Legitimate protests against the government could place tens of thousands of other Americans under federal surveillance. Similarly, internet use can be monitored without a user's knowledge, and internet providers can be forced to hand over user information to law enforcement officials without a warrant or subpoena. The bill also greatly expands the use of traditional surveillance tools, including wiretaps, search warrants, and subpoenas. Probable cause standards for these tools are relaxed or even eliminated in some circumstances. Warrants become easier to obtain and can be executed without notification. Wiretaps can be placed without a court order. In fact, the FBI and the CIA now can tap telephones or computers nationwide without demonstrating that a criminal suspect is using a particular phone or computer. The biggest problem with these new law enforcement powers is that they bear little relationship to fighting terrorism. Surveillance powers are greatly expanded while checks and balances on governments are greatly reduced. Most of the provisions have been sought by domestic law enforcement agencies for years, not to fight terrorism, but rather to increase their police powers over the American people. There is no evidence that our previously held civil liberties posed a barrier to the effective tracking or prosecution of terrorists. The federal government has made no showing that it failed to detect or prevent the recent terrorist strike because of the civil liberties that will be compromised by this new legislation. In his speech to the joint session of Congress following September 11th's attack, President Bush reminded all of us that the United States outlasted and defeated Soviet totalitarianism in the last century. The numerous internal problems in the former Soviet Union, its centralized economic planning and lack of free markets, its repression of human liberty, and its excessive militarization all led to its inevitable collapse. We must be vigilant to resist the rush toward ever-increasing state control of our society so that our own government does not become a greater threat to our freedoms than any foreign terrorists. The executive order that has gotten the most attention by those who are concerned that our response to 9/11 is overreaching and dangerous to our liberties is the one authorizing military justice in secret. Nazi war criminals were tried in public, but plans now are being laid out, carry out the trials and punishment, including possibly the death penalty, outside the eyes and ears of the legislative and judicial branches of government and the American public. Since such a process threatens national security and the Constitution, it cannot be used as a justification for their protection. Some have claimed this military tribunal has been in the planning stages for 5 years. If so, what would have been its justification? The argument that FDR did it, and therefore it must be okay, is a rather weak argument. Roosevelt was hardly one that went by the rule book, the Constitution. But the situation then was quite different from today. There was a declared war by Congress against a precise enemy, the Germans, who sent 8 saboteurs into our country. Convictions were unanimous, not by 2/3 of the panel, and appeals were permitted. That's not what's being offered today. Besides, the previous military tribunal expired when the war was over. Since this war will go on indefinitely, so too will these courts. The real outrage is that such an usurpation of power can be accomplished with the stroke of a pen. It may be that we have come to that stage in our history when an executive order is the law of the land, but it's not kind of cool, as one member of the previous administration bragged. It's a process that is unacceptable even in this professed time of crisis. There are well-documented histories of secret military tribunals. Up until now, the United States has consistently condemned them. The fact that a 2/3 majority can sentence a person to death in secrecy in the United States is scary. With no appeals available and no defense attorneys of choice being permitted, should compel us to reject such a system outright. Those who favor these trials claim that they are necessary to halt terrorism in its tracks. We are told that only terrorists will be brought before these tribunals. This means that the so-called suspects must be tried and convicted before they are assigned to this type of trial without due process. They will be deemed guilty by hearsay, in contrast to the traditional American system of justice, where all are innocent until proven guilty. This turns the justice system on its head. One cannot be reassured by believing these courts will only apply to foreigners who are terrorists. Sloppiness in convicting criminals is a slippery slope. We should not forget that the Davidians at Waco were convicted and demonized and slaughtered outside our judicial system, and they were, for the most part, American citizens. Randy Weaver's family fared no better. It has been said that the best way for us to spread our message of freedom, justice, and prosperity throughout the world is through example and persuasion, not through force of arms. We have drifted a long way from that concept. Military courts will be another bad example for the world. We were outraged in 1996 when Lori Berenson, an American citizen, was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life by a Peruvian military court. Instead of setting an example, now we are following the lead of a Peruvian dictator. The ongoing debate regarding the use of torture in rounding up the criminals involved in the 9/11 attacks is too casual. This can only represent progress in the cause of liberty and justice. Once government becomes more secretive, it is more likely this tool will be abused. Hopefully, the Congress will not endorse or turn a blind eye to this barbaric proposal. For every proposal made to circumvent the judicial system, it's intended that we visualize that these infractions of the law and the Constitution will apply only to the terrorists and never involve innocent U.S. citizens. This is impossible because someone has to determine exactly who to bring before the tribunal, and that involves all of us. That is too much arbitrary power for anyone to be given in a representative government, and is more characteristic of a totalitarian government. Many throughout the world, especially those in the Muslim countries, will be convinced by the secretive process that the real reason for military courts is that the U.S. lacks sufficient evidence to convict in an open court. Should we be fighting so strenuously the war against terrorism and carelessly sacrifice our traditions of American justice? If we do, the war will be for naught and we will lose.
And we will lose. That's what he said there at the end. And this actually is about a 45-minute speech. Ron
The
Paul,
largest number of people to be locked up.
this is the real Patriot Act, if you ask me. This is at the height of George W. Bush's power. This is, following the attacks of September 11th. There's still, maybe there's still kind of smoke and ash rising from the site of the World Trade Center. My twin brother almost worked there. He had applied for a job at Cantor Fitzgerald in the late 90s or maybe in 2000 or something like that. He got turned down from the job and he ended up working for a different firm. But he could have been there that day. We'd actually been on the Twin Towers. I grew up in New York. And so I remember going there with my parents and my brothers and my sister. And, that was cool. Like, wow, you can see everything from here. And so when the towers came down, I'm 21 years old at the time. It's like, oh my goodness. And then you remember, it's like, oh, my brother could have been working there. Oh my goodness. It's like, oh, that could have been any one of us. And so you think about, what would you do to protect your family? Number one, what would you do to protect your country? And these were the questions that Congress was being asked at the time. And here was Ron Paul standing up and saying that, well, just because we were attacked does not mean we no longer have a constitution. There's no wartime exception to the Constitution, is I think kind of the key point he's making here. And so I find it both a very interesting speech and a very important speech at a certain time in American history when this was dissent. He was able to command the floor of the House for 45 minutes. The speech actually goes on for 45 minutes. And then it wouldn't be the last speech he would give in front of Congress. Periodically, as the Patriot Act would come up for a renewal, so too would Ron Paul come to the House floor to deliver his objections to what he perceived, and I think correctly, not incorrectly, but correctly, he identified as a police state. Here he is in 2003.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remark.
Without objection.
I rise in support of this amendment. I want to compliment the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Otter, for bringing this to the floor. When the Patriot Act was passed, it was in the passions following 9/11, and that bill should have never been passed. It was brought up carelessly, casually, in a rapid manner. The bill that had been discussed in the Judiciary Committee was removed during the night before we voted. The full text of this bill was very difficult to find. I'm convinced that very few members were able to really review this bill before voting. That bill should have never passed. We certainly should continue to maintain the sunset provisions, but that's a long way off, and we should be starting to reform and improve this particular piece of legislation. This is our first chance to do so. I've had many members in the Congress come to me and on the quiet admit to me that voting for the Patriot Act was the worst bill and the worst vote they've ever cast. And this will give them an opportunity. Although this is very narrow, it's just too bad we couldn't have made this more broad. And it's too bad that we are not going to get to vote on Mr. Sanders' amendment to make sure that without the proper search warrant that the federal government wouldn't have access to the library records. But there is no need ever to sacrifice liberty
in order to maintain security. I feel more secure when I have more liberty, and that's why I'm a defender of liberty, because my main concern is security, both in the physical sense as well as the financial sense. I think the freer the country is, the more prosperous we are. And the freer the country is, the more secure we are. And yet it was in the atmosphere of post 9/11 that so many were so anxious to respond to what they perceived as demands by the people to do something. But just to do something, if you're doing the wrong thing, what good is it? You're doing more harm. But my main argument is that there is never a need to sacrifice liberty in order to protect liberty. And that is why we would like to at least remove this clause in here that allows sneak and peek search warrants. It took hundreds, if not thousands of years to develop this concept that governments do not have the right to break in without the proper procedures. And there has to be probable cause. And yet we threw that out the window in this post 9/11 atmosphere. And we gave away a lot. Yes, we talk in the numbers of dozens of examples of times when our government has used this and abused it. But that's only the beginning. It's the principle. If they had only done it once, if they had not done it, this should be still taken care of. Because as time goes on, and if we adapt to this process, it will be used more and more, and that is throwing away a big and important chunk of our Constitution, the Fourth Amendment. Not only should we do whatever we can to reform that legislation, but we already know that there's a Patriot Act number 2. It hasn't been given us to the Congress, but the administration has it out there. It's available, but we only get to see it from the internet. So in that bill, there's a proposal that the government can strip us of our citizenship. And then anybody then stripped of their citizenship could be put into the situation that many foreigners find themselves in Guantanamo. So I see this as a very, very important issue. If anybody cares about liberty, if anybody cares about personal freedom and the rule of law, and the need for probable cause before our government comes barging into our houses. And it has been under the guise of drug laws that have in the past instituted many of these things, but this is much worse. This has been put into an explicit piece of legislation, and the American people in this Congress ought to become very alert to this and how serious this piece of legislation is. I hope that the Congress and our colleagues here will support this amendment. It is very necessary, and it will be voting the Constitution, and it will be voting for liberty if we support this amendment.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin?
And so that was in 2003. I suppose there was an amendment coming up that would have been able to kind of rein in some of the powers of the Patriot Act. I believe it failed. But Ron Paul never ever gave up. He ran for president in 2008, Patriot Act still in effect. And here we are in 2011. And he's once again speaking out against these surveillance powers. And again, note the compassion with which he speaks. You know, he's saying like, hey, you're running roughshod over the Constitution. Please don't do that. He's participating in the civil society. He's acting as his constituents' representative in the U.S. House of Representatives in a venue that was open to him because he was duly elected by his constituents to go press those concerns. But he never, ever gave up. And here he was in 2011, again, trying to, roll back the Patriot Act, get it repealed. I think this is when the sunset's coming up. Let's take a listen to this.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill. I was opposed to the Patriot Act in 2001 and do not believe now that it's a good idea to extend it. The Fourth Amendment is rather clear. It says that we should be secure in our papers, our persons, our homes, and our effects. And that if warrants are to be issued, we have to do it with probable cause and describe in particular the places, the people, and the things that we're going to look at. And I think what has happened, though, it started a lot earlier than that. When the FISA law was originally written in 1978, that really introduced the notion that the Fourth Amendment was relative and not absolute. And later on, it was further weakened in 98, and then, of course, in 2001. I think our reaction to the horrors of 9/11, we can understand the concern and the fear that was developed, but I think the reaction took us in the wrong direction, because the assumption was made, of course, that we weren't spending enough money on surveillance. And even though then our intelligence agencies received $40 billion, they didn't give us the right information. So now we're spending $80 billion. But it also looks like the conclusion was that the American people had too much privacy. And if we undermine the American people's privacy, somehow or another, we're going to be safer. I think another thing that has come up lately has been that the purpose of government is to make us perfectly safe. Now, it is good to be safe, but governments can't make us safe. I question whether or not we have been made safer by the Patriot Act. But let's say a law makes us somewhat safer. Is that a justification for the government to do anything they want? For instance, if you want to be perfectly safe from child abuse and wife beating, the government could put a camera in every one of our houses and our bedrooms, and maybe there would be somebody made safer this way, but what would you be giving up? So perfect safety is not the purpose of government. What we want from government is to enforce the law and to protect our liberties. This, to me, has been, especially since 9/11, a classical example of sacrificing liberty for safety and security. Now, I didn't invent those terms. They've been around a long time, and it's easily justified, and I can understand it because I was here in 2001 when this came up, and people become frightened. The American people want something done, but I think this is misdirected and not it doesn't serve our benefits. So I think at this time we should really question why we're extending this. We're extending the three worst parts. Why were these sunsetted? Because people had concern about them. They weren't sure they were good pieces, and maybe they were overkill, and therefore they were saying we better reassess it. So what have we done? We have already extended it twice, and here we're going to do it again with the intent, I think, in a year to reassess this. But this bill doesn't make things worse. It doesn't make anything better, but it does extend what I consider and others consider bad legislation. I ask for a no vote on this legislation.
So there he was, speaking out once again against the Patriot Act, and this was one of the sunset opportunities, and Congress obviously renewed it. But I do find Ron Paul to be, a man of principle. And, he was right. And you know what? I was wrong. I'm in 2001, I wasn't studying political science yet, but because of 9/11, I changed my major. I went to a different school, and I ended up studying political science. What I should have done first was read the Constitution and gotten into that instead of jumping into the how do we prevent attacks on U.S. Soil. How do you prevent that sort of thing? Because that was a popular position to take at that time, not the position Ron Paul was taking, but the position that George W. Bush was taking, the position that much of the government, 98-1. 350 or whatever, to very little opposition in the so what was it, 357-66 in the House. That was the Patriot Act, a very popular piece of legislation in the House, and even more popular in the Senate. 98-1 was how that passed, and only required for majority. 51 votes, but they got 98 votes. It was nearly unanimous. So nobody opposed what was being done. But what Ron Paul was alleging was being used basically for a dragnet and then look at all the predictions that he had made in 2001 that basically ended up coming true. He was saying that there would be, phone calls under surveillance. Ed Snowden revealed about more than 200 million phone calls under surveillance. And that that there would be these powers would be used against otherwise kind of law-abiding, peaceful citizens for advocating Now, Brandenburg v. Ohio is a very important 1969 U.S. Supreme Court decision. What it basically found was the freedom of speech applies until there's an imminent danger to someone else's life and limb, or to the or even to the government. Like, so basically, you could advocate overthrowing the government, but not as long as you're not actually acting on that. Like, you can't or you can't like order a hit on somebody. That would pose an imminent danger as well. That would not be protected speech. So and it's the most, I think, most important decision protecting the freedom of speech. But what Ron Paul was warning us was that mere advocacy would be an incident for surveillance, and that is certainly what has happened. Certainly what has happened, and not even for advocating violence or overthrow or anything like that. As we mentioned, the FISA investigation of Donald Trump was on made-up charges that he was a Russian agent, that he had helped the Moscow to hack the DNC and to put the DNC and John Podesta emails onto WikiLeaks. And this went on for months and months and years when it got carried over into the Trump administration, even after he was elected. President sworn into office, and the executive branch is carrying out a top secret investigation of the sitting president. And so it was used against the most powerful person in the country. Ron Paul was right. It's used against all of us. That's what Ed Snowden revealed. And so I think that these dangers are clearly evident. And so this is something, I feel responsible for. Why? Because I was advocating for it in 2003. I'm still in college. I'm writing a blog, though, and I want to make sure that everyone's going to be safe. At first, I thought, you'll need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But in any event, this was a principle of security. How arrogant I was. Under this principle, the truth should be known to all except when it A, poses a threat to peace and security of the society and to the lives and liberties of the people, in which case the governing body, state, identifies and documents all information so as to make it reasonably available to certain positions and offices open to all, and made publicly available when the certainty of the threat is realized and proven beyond a preponderance of evidence. First, I thought, reasonable doubt. But then it's like, wait, you won't know that an attack is going to happen if you wait for proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's go to a more probable cause standard. So this is kind of thinking about intelligence activities, mostly the idea that you would have kind of a secret way of gathering information about threats to the country. And then the other provision was, or the truth should be known to all except when it infringes upon the individual liberties, particularly privacy. So then I suppose that, condition A, overall peace and security, is going to invariably override condition B, a reasonable expectation to privacy. So what would our circumstances I thought that this would be justified? And I was looking one up. So this is called the aerial measuring system. This is a means, and this is from the Department of Energy. Okay, National Nuclear Security Administration. What's the aerial measuring system? Is a rapidly deployable capability that can respond to all manner of nuclear incidents and accidents in the United States and overseas. It is part of NNSA's Nuclear Emergency Support Team. AMS consists of a fleet of aircraft equipped with specialized radiation detection systems to provide real-time measurements of air and ground radiation contamination. AMS scientists, technical personnel, and pilots are all on call 365 days per year, 24 hours per day to deploy in response to nuclear incidents or accidents. So this is demonstrating a capability of the federal government to detect radiation, probably in the event that there's fallout from like a nuclear meltdown or there's a radiological attack. But so suppose you carry this to the next kind of logical step here. What if you were to just put radiation detectors everywhere, put them all across the interstate highway system, and all the nearby neighborhoods and everywhere else, and you could just detect radiation everywhere? If the government could do that, should it do that? Those radiation detection equipment eventually is probably going to penetrate residences and things like that, and that won't be without any warrant. But what if you're trying to track down a nuclear weapon? So this was kind of a threat to all peace and security. That was kind of what I was thinking about. Was like, you could probably justify something like that, a radiation detection system, of course, and that way you can spot weapons of mass destruction before they ever get deployed and get anywhere near the American people. So really what I was touching on, though, and again, should have read the Constitution, should have read the Federalist Papers first. Even if I'd only read a few of them, I hadn't read them nearly enough. But what you're talking about basically are examples of leaving the civil society and re-entering the state of nature, and under what circumstances that's justifiable. You have constitutional provisions for doing things like that. For example, to declare war requires an act of Congress, suspending writs of habeas corpus, etc. Also, so think about the individual situation. When could you possibly re-enter the state of nature? Well, what if you're under attack? You're going to have to engage in self-defense, perhaps even with deadly force, and that would be justifiable. You'll temporarily be in a state of nature as you fend for your life. Because if you don't, someone could be pulling a knife on you or pulling a gun on you. It could be in a kill or be killed situation, and self-defense would be legally justifiable. So that's an example where the civil society ceases, even if momentarily, and you enter a state of nature. Another example might be, I don't know, like there's a gunman or something. Someone's waving the gun around. They're threatening they're trying to take hostages or someone, and then the policeman shows up and he shoots the gunman dead before he gets to kill anyone. That would be a type of preemptive action, but in response to an imminent danger. So the thing I should have paid attention to via constitutional law, eventually I would be the Brandenburg Standard. The Brandenburg v. Ohio Standard would say that an imminent danger would be necessary in order to curtail, in that case, speech. Someone's calling in a hit. They're trying to get someone killed, so they're trying to hire a hitman or something like that. But that if it doesn't pose, and I was saying, use the clear and present danger test from Schenck v. United States, which is what Brandenburg overturned. Brandenburg overturned the shout, fire, in the crowded theater standard. This standard, the shout, fire in a crowded theater, that technically would pose an imminent danger. I think if there was like a stampede or something like that. But what more is it had to do with mere advocacy. And what Brandenburg was overturning was mere advocacy of violence or overthrow of government or something like that. And there's a huge difference, because if you can take advocacy, mere advocacy, First Amendment protected speech, and then translate it into a government investigation, well, then suddenly, as Ron Paul was noting, you had a ready-made excuse to surveil the entire internet, to look for advocacy on everyone's phone calls. If you could find that advocacy, it would set off, I don't know, something at the NSA, and then they'd be able to track it down. William Binney, former NSA employee, he spoke out against this. Ed Snowden, he was an NSA contractor. He spoke out against this. These people were trying to warn us about how this could be used against the American people. And so you can have a dangerous idea. You could think about reasons why in the state of nature, there might not be any security. There might not be any privacy. You might need to, in order to even have enough, say you're Robert Nozick wrote of dominant protective associations in kind of in a modern iteration of the state of nature. And so I supposed that you would need, if you're going to be a dominant protective association, you're probably going to need some intelligence. George Washington, he didn't get a warrant before he attacked the Hessians in New Jersey. So the Battle of Trenton, so you have it. It's like, so what should I have been paying attention to? Was this exception to the civil society, that in the civil society, it can't exist within the state of nature. So what was I confusing? I was supposing that you could have states of nature within the civil society under a constitutional framework. Can you really, though? And even if you could actually identify imminent threats to the American people, you can find the dirty bomb, or you can find a weapon of mass destruction before it goes off. What Ron Paul was asking, what were we sacrificing? What were we sacrificing? It's a constitutional order. There are no wartime exceptions to the U.S. Constitution. It's not in there. Look it up. Just try to find the wartime exception to the Fourth Amendment and the protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Because once you get beyond the Brandenburg Standard of an imminent danger, once you're looking for clear and present dangers, you're looking for mere advocacy of violence, of terrorism, or whatever, of law breaking of any kind. And then you have a nexus to conduct a government investigation, thereby creating a surveillance state, which is what we have, essentially speaking. Now you could say, well, in the advent of nuclear weapons in the atomic age, such means are necessary. So maybe you can justify the aerial measuring system, such as it is from the National Nuclear Security Administration, that conducts surveillance, that looks for radiation. And maybe they've already set up their detectors everywhere. Maybe that's like secret or something. Who knows? But I'm just supposing an example where you would conduct surveillance in the interest of protecting the country against an invasion. Or if, say, there was an invasion of America, would the civil society apply to the areas that have been invaded, or would Congress declare war, or even before war is declared, would the National Guard be called in to start fighting the enemy invaders before Congress has even had an opportunity to declare war or do anything like that? So I think you can see like where what we're talking about are exceptions to the constitutional order, self-defense or declarations of war, which are not exceptional to the constitutional order. They're provided for under the Constitution, but areas where we re-enter states of nature and when that's legitimate, in the context of the when you re-enter states of nature in the context of the Declaration of Independence, that this is a very important example. The first two words of the Declaration of Independence, written at the very top of it, are the in Congress, and it's about the members of the Continental Congress. They're convening to declare their independence. So there's a very important provision in the Constitution is the power to declare war. The president can't declare war. One person cannot take us all back into the state of nature. It takes an act of Congress. It took the votes of the 13 colonies and their representatives at the Continental Congress just to have independence. Even the Civil War, the secessions that occurred there were done under constitutional order of those states' constitutions when they were doing secessions. They have referendum and things like that, votes of state legislatures. So that was done in the context of people's representatives acting. And so too was the Patriot Act passed under such a guise. And so you can have exceptions to the constitutional framework. Another example would probably be the Insurrection Act, which was enacted during the George Washington administration to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, Washington never actually had to invoke it. I think there was this ever-present threat that he was going to have to basically federalize the Pennsylvania militia to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. But eventually the Pennsylvania governor intervened, and that, I guess, wasn't necessary. But Abraham Lincoln used it to enforce the Civil War, and that's just a standing statute out there. Eisenhower used it to federalize the Arkansas Guard to enforce Brown v. Board of Education. Heck, we endorsed Trump using it when the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon was being ransacked and nearly burnt to the ground. And, then there was a danger there that the state was not putting the guard on the ground. They weren't putting down the riots. You had lots of riots in 2020. Might be an example where there could be a provision where you need to call in the National Guard. If the governor won't do it, then the president, since George Washington, every administration's had this power to call in the guard and to restore civil order. And so these are the examples. And so that's kind of what I was thinking about. But Ron Paul was right. And he got, it wasn't some hypothetical, being, John Rawls' original position or, kind of theorizing about the state of nature. That's what I was up to when I was in college at the time. And I thought, oh, well, yeah, you can justify surveillance. And it probably, and maybe you could say it's limited circumstances. And that's what the Patriot Act does. These are limited circumstances. It covers 200, 300 million Americans. That's limited, right? The Congress passed the law. And it was under the limited powers of the Constitution that this was enacted. But Congress can enact unconstitutional laws. Again, there is no wartime exception to the Constitution. There's no wartime exception to the Bill of Rights. But we suppose that there is. But Ron Paul, he wasn't speaking from some hypothetical. He was talking about years of abuse, decades of abuse going back to, pre-Cold War, pre-World War II, all the way back to World War I, where anti-war protesters were put on trial for sedition, basically for speaking out against the draft, and this was considered a seditious act, and that you could be brought up on trial for basically questioning government's authority to conscript its citizens into a war that they might not feel is justified. So there's a context. So people be like, well, the First Amendment shouldn't apply to burning the flag, or you shouldn't be allowed to advocate against the draft, things like that. But these are First Amendment protected speech. And I think a civil society can accommodate opposing political viewpoints, even ones that, if Brandenburg v. Ohio can find that, you're allowed to advocate for the overthrow of the government, so long as you're not actually doing it. Yeah, then certainly we can, things like advocating against a war or advocating against the draft should not be considered. They are not really seditious in that capacity. You're not actually trying to enact the plan to overturn, the U.S. Constitution. That's a very, I think, important distinction there. Because otherwise, if there is no barrier, if you don't have to use the Brandenburg standard of an imminent danger, which is, I think, the standing constitutional jurisprudence on that, then anything kind of goes. The government can enter into the state of nature whenever it wants to enact war powers, to gather intelligence, but to go further. If you can justify violating the Fourth Amendment, protection of unreasonable searches, if there's mere advocacy of whatever, law breaking, violence, or down with the government, who cares? Someone says down with the government, and so could you violate the Fifth Amendment protection to the protection of life, liberty, or property? Can you steal their property? Can you deprive them liberty? Can you lock them up and throw it away to keep? Hey, someone said down with the government. Can you just shoot them? Does the Fifth Amendment cease applying if there's mere advocacy? If not, then why does the Fourth Amendment no longer apply when there's mere advocacy? And that's what things like the Patriot Act, I think, set up unintentionally. I think that's what the FISA system set up. Frank Church, he was investigating abuses of the pre-FISA system, CIA, FBI, looking at anti-war protesters, civil rights leaders in the 1960s. And he has the Church Committee. They uncover all these abuses that had been occurring. And then eventually they enact the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. He helped to write it. So he created the FISA court system, which invariably became a rubber stamp. Ron Paul was saying that in his speeches that the church-inspired FISA system was how this kind of got codified into law. But listen to what Frank Church was speaking out against, and the type of system that I think he predicted, that Ron Paul said we were enacting in 2001. That this is where we are now. This is the police state.
Follow up by asking, do you think that the CIA and military intelligence agencies and the FBI have used the emergency provisions, both in law and by emergency agency, the Federal Preparedness Agency it's called now, to have contingency plans which threaten the liberty of American citizens?
Mr. Rowan, in due course, the committee will pass judgment on those questions. I'm not going to pre-guess the committee or prematurely attempt to pass judgment on this program. But let me tell you this. In the need to develop a capacity to know what potential enemies are doing, the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. These messages are between ships at sea. They can be between units, military units in the field. We have a very extensive capability of intercepting messages wherever they may be in the airwaves. Now, that is necessary and important to the United States as we look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know. At the same time, that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people. And no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything, telephone conversations, telegrams, it doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. If this government ever became a tyranny, if a dictator ever took charge in this country, the technological capacity that the intelligence community has given the government could enable it to impose total tyranny. And there would be no way to fight back, because the most careful effort to combine together in resistance to the government, no matter how privately it was done, is within the reach of the government to know. Such is the capability of this technology. Now, why is this investigation important? I'll tell you why. Because I don't want to see this country ever go across the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America. And we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision, so that we never cross over that abyss. That's the abyss from which there is no return. The field.
So that's the abyss from which there is no return. Ron Paul was right. Frank Church was right. How do you stop this? I don't know. Maybe you had to do what Reagan was trying to do and just get rid of nuclear weapons altogether. Like, you'd have to come to some sort of international agreement with Gorbachev and all the other leaders of the world. We're going to abolish nuclear weapons or something. And then maybe people will feel a little safer, and that they don't need to just conduct dragnets everywhere to try to, find weapons of mass destruction, et cetera, et cetera. The threat, because the threat in a nuclear age, the threats to I think America are going to be ever present. It's always going to be just kind of like the sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, with which you can justify all manner of what he's describing: total tyranny, total surveillance. And he's saying that this technology, and think about it now in the digital age. So this was back in the 1970s, and kind of, you had computers, but I think that the capabilities would be much more massive now. I think that's what Snowden was showing us. Well, heck, that was a decade ago. So probably even now, it's probably even more sophisticated. I suppose when you think about advances in, you have like advances in artificial intelligence, but you would probably suppose that the government's probably 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 years ahead in their own technological advances, to things that would be classified or something, and how whatever they have technologically to conduct surveillance, if it were in the hands of a dictatorship, of some sort of military dictatorship or otherwise, would the capacity for total tyranny be there? And I think that's probably true. Yeah, I think it is. And so maybe elections matter more than ever. But it also, I think, kind of speaks to how far gone we are from a constitutional order. We speak about culture wars a lot, which I think the original culture wars were in the teens and the 20s, and it was about kind of the sunsetting of agrarian America and versus the modern America, the cities and the Industrial Revolution. So it was kind of industrial America versus agrarian America, and how people were leaving the farms. You're going to have more mechanization, so people come to the cities looking for work, et cetera. And so there's that kind of, I think, ever-present struggle between, if not industrial versus agrarian, in the sense that the culture war is between technology and liberty. And if ultimately the technology gets to the point that, as Frank Church was warning, as Ron Paul was warning, and just a few weeks, a couple months after September 11, he's kind of put two and two together and said, wait a second, this Patriot Act, we're starting to learn more about this. This is a real danger to the liberty of the American people. Sure, you'll start out looking for terrorists, but eventually it's going to be used against us. And hasn't it been? I mean, I think it's already been shown. It was used against the president of the United States. It can be used against anyone. And so again, I just asked a question, and I'll just kind of leave you with this. I see the chats going back and forth, and some partisan politicking going on. It's not a particularly long chat, so we'll just skip that today. If the use of surveillance under the Fourth Amendment in contravention of the Fourth Amendment is justified based upon mere advocacy of violence or law breaking or whatever, down with the government, then why isn't the Fifth Amendment? What can they contravene that? Can they deprive people of life? It's a serious question, because there is no wartime exception to the U.S. Constitution. Ron Paul was right, and I was wrong. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.